President Trump has just arrived in South Korea and is now on his way to deliver a speech to APEC CEOs ahead of a high-stakes, high-wire meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, a meeting that could well set the tone for global trade and markets for the rest of the year. Well, live from Singapore, this is Insight with Haslinda Amin, where we dive deeper into the stories that matter with crucial context and sharp analysis. President Trump is set to address a gathering of CEOs shortly ahead of his key meetings with the presidents of South Korea and China. On his way to Jeonju, he told reporters that he expects to lower the tariffs imposed on Chinese goods over the fentanyl crisis.
I expect to be lowering that because I believe that they're going to help us with the fentanyl situation. We haven't talked about the timing yet, but we're going to work out something. We're doing very well with rare earth, as you know, and we're, I think, going to make a big step with fentanyl.
Well, for more on this, let's get to Bloomberg's Yvonne Mann, who joins us now live from the APEC Summit venue in Jeonju. Yvonne, we've been talking about how it is high stakes, much anticipated, the most possibly consequential visit to the region. Talk to us about the tone. It's been positive in Malaysia, positive in Japan, and now positive in Korea.
And I think President Trump wants to keep that momentum alive as he steps down here in Jeonju. As you mentioned, he's going to be making that speech in just a couple of moments. But certainly what is at stake here, as you mentioned, right? We're starting to get a little bit more clarity, at least from the U.S. side of things, of what President Trump wants to discuss with Xi Jinping on Thursday here. From what we gather, as you mentioned about fentanyl, that could be substantial, right? That they might actually be willing to lower those 20% fentanyl tariffs to China there. These are, of course, additional tariffs. And the Wall Street Journal has reported it could be lowered, those levies, to as much as 10%. That could be a quick win for Beijing. And what we also heard on Air Force One was the possibility of discussing Nvidia's Blackwell chips to Xi Jinping, which could be quite substantial as well, given the fact that up until now, we've been talking about President Trump allowing Nvidia to ship H20 chips, the less advanced chips, to China. China, of course, has rejected that and really encouraged its local companies to buy chips at home and shun the H20. But Blackwell, of course, are the more advanced ones that China might need. So that could be a major concession from the U.S. side of things if, in fact, that does come into reality. So what does China have to deliver? With that, certainly maybe when it comes to rare earths, President Trump is hoping something could come about when it comes to these critical minerals and the export curbs that China has implemented in the last few weeks, this global licensing regime that has shocked a lot of the world here and global supply chains. So any clarity on that, if we in fact see some sort of deferral of those export curbs, as Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said just a few days ago, a deferral of 1 year, that could be some news as well. So certainly looking for some more commitments, some numbers behind things when it comes to soybean purchases, even Boeing planes. What we have not heard of what it could be a priority is maybe the issue of Taiwan. That was asked on Air Force One. And President Trump said, look, not sure if she's going to bring it up, about whether he wants, obviously, President Trump to change the U.S.'s notion and stance on Taiwan. President Trump said there's not much to ask when it comes to this issue. So perhaps not a priority from Trump is concerned. Also, when it came to a potential meeting with Kim Jong-un at the border, he says maybe in the future he's excited about meeting with Leader Kim. So maybe downplaying that possibility as well.
Well, it is a slew of issues, a slew of sticky issues that stand in the way of better ties between the U.S. and China. We talk about how, I guess it all depends on the details, and that's what investors are looking for. We talked about those Blackwell chips, which could be a game changer, and the market's already reacting to that. Give us a sense of what the market's actually looking for. What kind of details? The soybeans you talked about.
So I think what could be a breakthrough, or at least progress, is if there's a signed agreement of some sort from both sides. So it's not just talk, it's not just a reiteration of what was discussed in Kuala Lumpur at the ASEAN summit, but something that actually has a readout of some sort, an agreement that highlights how many soybeans could China buy, how many Boeing planes, So certainly, if there's some meat in the bones there, whether it's quantified numbers, that certainly could be progress, right? And it would eliminate the doubt that the market has on what really is positive vibes so far around a potential trade deal. Also, when it came to levies, right? If we actually see fentanyl tariffs coming down, that could be also something new. And rare earths, right? We talk about those things. So certainly that's going to be the key focus, I think, for now, is some of those key issues. But yes, when it comes to AI, we were just talking about the South Koreans' presidential office came through with what they want to be discussing with President Trump when Lee Jae-myung, the president, does meet with President Trump later on today. And it is talking about modernization of this alliance. So our sources from the U.S. side are telling us it could be anything about quantum computing, AI, and bolstering cooperation with the U.S. and South Korea on that front, 6G. So, these are all sort of technologies and things that, the U.S. is trying to gather at least more collaboration with this part of the world as a way to eliminate that competitive edge with China, right? It's all about countering Beijing. And it's similar pacts that we saw that the U.S. made with Japan, with the U.K. earlier this year as well. So certainly those are things that we're looking at between the U.S. and Korea side of things as well. That trade deal, a lot of issues, according to President Lee, that still need to be ironed out today.
Yvonne, stick around. Let's take a look at how markets are faring. Of course, some positive news when it comes to the markets. AI continuing to drive profits and deals at mega cap tech companies reporting earnings this week. Also, Trump commenting on Air Force One, as indicated by Yvonne earlier, that he will speak about Nvidia's Blackwell chip with President Xi Jinping, and this coming amid growing bets on a Federal Reserve that will cut rates. All that positivity boosting the Asia-Pac index, currently up by 0.5%. CSI 300, by the way, also in positive territory, higher by 0.4%. Gains pretty much across the benchmarks here in Asia. Let's get markets perspective with our Bloomberg MLive strategist, Mark Cranfield. And Mark, what could go wrong? It's all positive.
You can see that traders are setting a relatively low bar with their expectations for what comes out, particularly between the US and China talks this week. The fact that President Trump mentioned the Blackwell chips about Nvidia and the Nasdaq futures already increased here in Asia, unusually surpassing the highs from the previous evening. We don't see that very often in Asia, so that's a very positive sign for the markets overall that they're doing that. And that suggests that they were really maybe only expecting the sound bites to come out between Xi and Trump rather than hard details. Yvonne's saying it would be a pretty big step if they actually signed a document. Doesn't look as though investors are actually expecting a hard document on the table, more like promises of what would be done, whether it's in terms of soybeans, fentanyl, or other issues. So if we do get a signing, something like we've had earlier in the week with Japan and in Malaysia as well, markets could really take off here because that doesn't appear to be priced in. Now, the flip side, of course, is that they come out of the meeting and Trump is unhappy with what he hears from the Chinese side and straight away starts saying that he wants to go back to renegotiating various things, or that he's ready to put those tariffs on the 1st of November, which he threatened to do before. That isn't the base case for investors right now, but it would come as a shock if something like that happened.
Lots of issues already on the table. Lots of issues have been discussed. Fentanyl, soybeans, export controls. But there are fundamental issues which have not been touched, like national security, right? I mean, you got to wonder where we go from here.
From the market's point of view, those are such big items in terms of defense, what it might mean for defense spending.
Rebalancing of trade, for instance. How does China get access when there's a lid put on its investments in the U.S.?
Well, they would probably have to step up with something like some other countries have promised in terms of building plants in America itself. Now, how many hurdles they have to go through to get to that is another matter, of course. But willingness to bring business to the United States seems to go down very well with the U.S. administration. So any signals at all that there are Chinese companies, and there will be some represented at the sessions in Beijing. So if big Chinese companies want to add to business currently being done in America or bring new business, that should go down extremely well with the American side. There's no promises at the moment from that point of view. It will be a very pleasant surprise if it happens.
As it stands now, AI chips are free to go higher, right? We've had messaging from Trump. Now we have messaging from Jensen Huang himself saying, you know what bubble? If you take a look at, Nvidia's new chips set to generate $500 billion in terms of revenue. So the path is clear for the AI rally to continue. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I mean, we just today, Hynix had reported very strong numbers and said that they're sold out for 2026 on chips. Avantes in Japan is up at one stage 22% today on profits, again driven by AI demand. We're going to hear from 3 mega companies in the States later today. Meta is probably the one that people will look at the most closely. It's been doing a lot of AI work. If they say that demand is still strong and that they're building further into 2026, again, it fuels the whole debate. And as you say, Nvidia almost rose 5% overnight. It's rapidly heading towards $5 trillion. And we haven't even had their results yet. They don't come for a few weeks.
And Mark, I mean, you talk about all this optimism around AI. We haven't even talked about the Fed, right? That's meeting on Wednesday. It seems like, this is going to be a cut, this meeting, but there's still a lot of lingering questions on whether they can signal at least December what's going to happen there. What should we be looking out for from Jay Powell and really this FOMC?
Jerome Powell may want to leave it a bit vague for December in the sense that there's going to be some more data, and if the US shutdown ends, there'll be a lot more data to come. There'll be a big catch-up from that point of view between now and December. Everyone's expecting the rate cut, of course, 25 basis points. The one that's probably not fully priced into the market is if the Fed confirm that they're going to stop reducing their balance sheet. That runoff they've been talking about, it looks as though it's on the table for discussion at this meeting. Whether they confirm it to happen straight away or later in the year, if they put a specific timetable on it, markets will probably take it very enthusiastically, probably see some flattening of the Treasury yield curve, which in itself is a positive signal for equity markets and probably a bit of a weakener for the US dollar. But certainly that would act as an increase. If there's a 25 basis points rate cut and you stop the balance sheet as well, it's almost like adding a bit more to the easing cycle. It's adding a few more basis points to that rate cut as well. So there's still quite a bit that can come out of this meeting, even though it looks as though we know quite a bit in advance.
There's stopping the runoff. I'm just wondering whether there are really stresses in the capital markets.
If there are, it's not 100% clear what they might be. We've just been hearing this week from the CEO at Goldman Sachs saying he's not worried about the credit situation. Other major funds have been saying he doesn't see excessive stresses in that market as well. And yet, we've also heard whispers about the cockroaches that might be there as well, particularly related to the private credit side of things. It may well be very early stages, people just giving warning signals about what might be coming in several months' time. The Fed wouldn't be alarmist. They would not be trying to preempt that at any means. It could well be, though, that in the background they are going around and checking everybody very carefully. Make sure, have you got enough collateral? What's your capital situation? They certainly wouldn't want to be putting too much of that into the public domain yet. It could cause a panic. We don't want to see equity markets selling off, as we've seen with the savings banks in a couple of years ago. Once that word gets out there, they can sell off very, very quickly. So they'd be cautious from that point of view. But they have a due diligence job to do. It's part of their responsibility as the regulator.
Lots in play for the Fed, lots in play for the BOJ as well. And we had Scott Bessent actually weighing in, saying that the BOJ needs that space to rein in inflation, and it has to do what it needs to do. How are you reading that? Shouldn't we be reading into that?
We definitely should be, particularly after this week he has been saying that he wouldn't comment on the Bank of Japan, and there we are, he's done exactly that. Now, he chose his words very carefully, but what traders are looking at is the fact that he has previously said he thinks the Bank of Japan is behind the curve on raising interest rates, and clearly what he said today is going to make them think, well, this is an extension of that, considering that there's a meeting coming up this week. So yes, traders bought the yen, they sold Japanese bonds. It's the kind of reaction you would expect. It probably puts a bit of pressure on Governor Ueda for his press conference. Bennett is probably saying to him, yes, I want to see you be a bit more hawkish during your press conference.
All right, Mark, thank you. Bloomberg MLive strategist Mark Cranfield and the China Show co-anchor Yvonne Mann with us. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.
We're currently assuming China is going to be 0% of our business. And if it comes back, if President Trump was able to negotiate, or if China would like us to come back to China, it's going to be a huge bonus for us.
Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang speaking at the company's GTC event in Washington, where he announced a flurry of new partnerships and dismissed concerns about an AI bubble. Well, in those partnerships, Nvidia announced it's teaming up with Uber, Palantir, and CrowdStrike, among others, to ensure its technology remains at the heart of the AI frenzy. Nvidia's tie-ups reflect its increasingly global ambitions. The company is planning a $1.2 billion data center in Germany with Deutsche Telekom AG. Huang is also set to unveil pacts with Samsung and Hyundai when visiting South Korea this week. Nvidia also taking a $1 billion equity stake in Nokia and plans to supply the telecom company with AI-powered computers for wireless networks. The CEOs of both companies spoke with us about the new partnership.
For national security reasons, for economic reasons, our industry should be built on American technology, and for the very first time, we can do that. We have a brand new product line that takes advantage of computing, accelerated computing, and AI, and we have a great partner to help us do it with, Nokia.
The market reaction kind of speaks for itself. There was a time when Nokia was already looking to America. You've been in the role since April, but may I start by asking you what role the administration played in bringing you both together, if this is indeed a strategic priority?
Well, I don't think there was anything specific that the administration did, other than they've created the environment to support innovation. I mean, Jensen's talked about manufacturing, but it's also about R&D and innovation and technology leadership. And if you think about where this world is going and all those incredible devices that are going to be built on Nvidia platforms, robotics, autonomous vehicles, augmented reality, virtual reality, we need a different kind of network in the future. And that's what we realized. And that's why we wanted to forge this partnership, so that we're building a network leveraging AI for AI services. And that's really the big change here.
And the technology is flowing both ways. I mean, what is it that you will be able to do with Nokia, Jensen, that you weren't able to do on your own?
Well, first of all, Nokia is in all of the world's base stations. And this AirScale platform of Nokia is in millions of base stations around the world. If our computers are not inside that base station, it doesn't help. It's no different than NVIDIA's tech computing platforms not inside a car, it doesn't help. And so the first thing is we need a partner to get us into the world's space stations. We also, remember, we're bringing AI to radio networks, AI to RAN, so that we can make wireless tech communications a lot more efficient. Second, we're bringing AI for the radio, meaning on top of these radio networks and these telecommunication network, we're going to be able to provide AI services, which is going to be able to make it easier for us to do robotics and autonomous vehicles and industrial automation and reach all of the different places around the world. That's kind of hard to do with Wi-Fi. Cellular reads everything. And so we now have this fabric that we can deploy AI computing services on top of it. It's going to be completely revolutionary.
In your world and in your market, Huawei is an influential player, not just in Europe, I think also about the Middle East and Africa. How important is the relationship with Nvidia to be able to counter, what Huawei does in those markets?
Yeah, look, I think for us, one of the principles I've had with my team since coming in has been do what we can do that no one else can do, and that is AirScale, what we do with AnyRAN software, the software that runs on it that we're going to be putting on the NVIDIA ARC platform. That, do what we can do well and partner with the best everywhere else. And this is a clear opportunity to partner with the best. And by the way, that's where America and the Western world succeeds, because we don't necessarily have one company doing everything everything like Huawei. We succeed because we partner aggressively. And if you watch GTC today, it was hard to not find it obvious that you're partnering with everybody. But that's the advantage, is this partnership. So we do what we do best. We let Nvidia do what they do best, and ultimately our customers win. And ultimately, for America, I think America will win because there'll be more innovation faster here.
Nobody knows telecommunications better than Nokia. They've been at it for a long time. They're all over the world. And between our two partnerships, we now have wireless telecommunications, we have AI, and we have accelerated computing, all in this partnership.
The CEOs of Nvidia and Nokia speaking to Bloomberg Tech anchor Ed Ludlow. Now, staying with chips, shares in SK Hynix trading higher after it reported better than expected third quarter profits in the latest bullish signal for global AI demand growth. Let's bring in Asia stocks reporter Yuk-Yung Lee. And Yuk-Yung, if you take a look at the numbers from Hynix, massive upside. It's up 60% in terms of profit. And when it comes to those chips for next year, they're already sold out. So strong signals for the company.
Absolutely, Haslinda. So I think a lot of market investors have been expecting that it's going to be another great quarter for SK Hynix, and indeed it was a stunning quarter. And not only that, looking forward, the company has flagged a really robust outlook for chip demand, not only in 2026 but also in 2027, saying that supply is not going to catch up demand anytime soon. So that sent SK Hynix shares to trade close to the all-time high again this morning. And remember, SK Hynix share have tripled this year alone. And so we just saw this a flurry of investment news and deals from Nvidia and between South Korea and United States, and as well as Amazon Web Services. All this great news about AI is bringing attention again to companies like SK Hynix that supply crucial chips for this AI infrastructure globally.
You can only imagine it would want to ramp up capacity. What are investment plans for the company?
Yes, so SK Hynix said its CAPEX for 2026 is going to be significantly higher than 2025. That's also another bullish signal for companies. It means that there's going to be so much demand that the chip companies won't be able to meet even after it raises CAPEX significantly. So as we had heard from Jensen Huang, Nvidia CEO earlier, who said we are not in AI bubble, I think SK Hynix is proving that with actual numbers and outlook and the company's guidance. So I think that's why we're seeing its shares trading really strong this morning, which is also helping the benchmark Kospi to reach its all-time high again.
Yuk-Yung, thank you so much for that. Bloomberg Asia stocks reporter Yuk-Yung Lee joining us there. Let's take a look at how it's shaping up for the U.S. markets. Of course, here in Asia, it is a positive day on the back of optimism to do with AI, to do with the Fed as well. S&P futures currently trending higher, up 0.1%. In terms of the dollar, it is flat at 12.10. Of course, we've heard from the likes of Jensen Huang pushing back on that AI rally, and that's providing some optimism in the market as well. He said that his latest chips are set to generate $500 billion in revenue. That's one positive news for the market. The other, Fed in focus, it is expected to lower rates by 0.25 percentage point, and for Powell to offer little guidance. Of course, front and center, that labor data, that continues to play a larger role in that debate. The Fed watchers see a growing chance of the committee will stop the runoff of Treasury securities from its balance sheet. Again, S&P futures pointing to a higher open, and here in Asia, it's also a positive day. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Insight, and here are some of the top China stories we're following. We're watching Jiangxi Copper this morning after third quarter net income beat the street. Profit jumped 35% on year to 1.85 billion yuan, while the miner saw its revenue grow 14% from a year ago. Bloomberg has learned that Starbucks sees Boyu Capital as the front runner in its search for a partner in its China business. Sources say the private equity firm is the likeliest buyer after outbidding others, including Carlyle Group. A potential deal could value Starbucks' Chinese operations at more than $4 billion. Ping An Insurance saw its profit rise 11% in the first 9 months of this year. That's as the stock market rally lifted investment returns and policy sales expanded. Solid demand for savings products and higher margins also promised to bolster new business value for Ping An's life insurance operation. And China has pledged to significantly boost domestic consumption over the next 5 years while keeping technology and manufacturing as top priorities. The Communist Party pledge aims to reduce reliance on exports after trade tensions escalated sharply this year. Let's bring in our China correspondent, Min Lo. And Min, what measures in particular is the government taking to boost consumption? Of course, they've been talking about this for a very long time.
Yes, indeed. We have been seeing a very stubborn deflationary streak. And yes, once again, China is outlining its 5-year plan and indicating that consumption will be a key focus. It wants to raise consumption's share of the GDP. It's currently at 40% and far below the global average of around 56%. So still a long way to go. And some of the measures include improving people's livelihoods by increasing spending on public welfare, promoting employment, improving income distribution. The specific steps as to how they will get there, that is still lacking at this point. The document that was released by state media also touched on anti-involution, talking about promoting healthy competition that is based on quality rather than price, and also increasing investment as a means to drive growth, right? Including iconic construction projects that could increase demand for construction materials and provide jobs as well. And you got to see this in the backdrop of that U.S.-China trade war and how exports may no longer be a sustainable driver of growth. And that's why President Xi was saying in a speech that was quoted by state media saying that China really needs to double down on ensuring it has a healthy domestic economy in order to counter all of that uncertainties from the external environment.
And Min, tech self-reliance also still remaining the top priority. You'd only imagine that's the stance Xi Jinping will take in his talks with President Trump tomorrow.
That's right. Tech self-reliance also the number one priority, ranked higher than consumption in that 5-year plan. And again, you think about how President Trump is in South Korea right now, expected to sign that tech pact with South Korea on areas like AI, quantum computing, 6G, mobile technology. These are the same areas that China really wants to have breakthroughs and investments on. It wants to have disruptive technologies, especially in core areas like chips, advanced industrial equipment, as well as emerging pillars like new materials, new energy, for example. And it's interesting, right? President Trump on Air Force One was talking about even discussing the Blackwell chips with China. And we've been talking about how China is looking at potentially deferring the rare earth export controls. And many analysts have been speaking to us saying that this is really a nuclear option for China. They're not likely to back down on that unless they get something similarly powerful in terms of concession from the U.S. And could that be the access to the highly advanced Blackwell chips that could power China's AI development? So certainly something that we will be closely watching tomorrow when President Trump and Xi meets.
Min, great perspective. Bloomberg's China correspondent, Min Lo. Now, we've been hearing from top U.S. lenders from the Future Investment Initiative in Riyadh on global credit risks. Take a listen.
A lot of the noise and drama around private credit is, somehow that there's a whole bunch of risk that's hidden in the system because it's no longer in the banking system, and that's going to present some systemic exposure. I don't see it. At some point, if the credit cycle turns down, they'll have losses.
Okay.
And those investors will have lower returns or negative returns. But that's business.
We haven't had a correction in a long time. We haven't had a recession in a long time. And so the closer you get to that time period, nobody knows when it is. You have to make sure that the clients and the balance sheet of whether it's it's an individual, an institution, a sovereign wealth fund, or our own bank, is able to sustain that. There aren't major signs, but you're seeing, little pockets of it. You see a little amend and extend on credit terms and the like, and so we're watching it, and we're watching it very closely.
Bloomberg also spoke exclusively at the event with Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon. He downplayed growing concerns about systemic risks in the credit market and also discussed his outlook for the Fed.
The Fed, will cut rates tomorrow, and then we'll see. I know the consensus is you'll get another cut before the end of the year, but the policy rate has been higher. I think they're looking to move more toward neutral, and so we'll take a step in that direction. But I think the Fed always is an observer of what's going on in the real-time economy. The real-time economy can shift very quickly. At the moment, I would say the U.S. economy is in quite good shape, but I wouldn't jump forward. There are lots of forward prognostications about the path of interest rates. I would just highlight mostly, I'd look at the moment. You can project forward, but just because there's a forward projection, it doesn't mean that's where we'll wind up.
There's still a lot of uncertainty out there.
There's a lot of uncertainty.
Another thing that needs to be watched carefully is perhaps, the credit situation. A couple of weeks ago, we were talking about Tricolor, First Brands. One of your peers in the industry described there being potentially cockroaches around. I don't know if there's a certain insect reference that you want to pick up on, but ultimately, how worried are you about some of these individual idiosyncratic credit incidents actually becoming systemic?
I think this is a great opportunity for people that are in credit businesses and are deploying significant capital as lenders in credit businesses to look at their procedures, their practices, their underwriting standards, look through their portfolio, and really take a strong evaluation of where they are.
Yeah.
You can't separate the fact that we've been in a very, very long, easy credit cycle, one of the longest I've seen in my career, without a real credit pullback, without an economic environment that's really put an enormous amount of pressure on credit. And in that context, credit spreads are historically tight.
Yeah.
And I know at some point there will be a credit cycle. It will probably come at a period of time when the economy slows more acutely, or there's some sort of a macro event that changes confidence we have in growth and the trajectory of the economy. And when that happens, given the velocity of lending activity, there will be losses in credit, and those losses will be felt across the system. But that's different than a systemic crisis. And I don't see anything in the context of a handful of bad credit situations that's leading me to say that we have a systemic issue around the corner.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, lenders make mistakes. There is fraud in markets. And that's something that as lenders we all have to try to protect against. But we should not be fooled by the fact that this is a very robust credit environment. Credit spreads are tight. And when we do have a cycle, which probably will come when there's an economic slowdown, there will be losses, and we'll feel that across the economy.
And that was Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon speaking exclusively with Bloomberg's Jumana Basachi at the Future Investment Initiative in Riyadh. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. President Trump is set to address a gathering of CEOs shortly ahead of his key meetings with presidents of South Korea and China. For more on this, Bloomberg's Yvonne Mann joins us now live from the APEC Summit venue in Jeonju. He is headed where you are, Yvonne, and we know that he's expected to talk to the business community. I mean, just to put it in context, Korea is an important market for the U.S. What is he expected to say?
I think it's going to be continuation of what we saw, in his trip to Asia, right? What we saw in Malaysia, what we saw in Japan, and hopefully keeping that momentum alive. That President Trump is here to really do business with the region, and really rack up the flurry of deals, right? You talk about Nvidia possibly talking to the likes of Samsung, SK Hynix here during this trip. So certainly that is going to be the key focus on what trade deals and what deals come about in terms of collaboration. The South Koreans have mentioned about this whole modernization of this U.S. alliance. So they talk about things like AI and try to boost collaboration between the two nations when it comes to quantum computing, 6G as well, all these sort of technologies in a way to counter, of course, what we've been seeing in the innovation from China. So that certainly is the theme, I guess, maybe here while we embark and wait for President Trump to arrive here in Gyeongju. Just moments ago, his helicopter was spotted hovering around Gyeongju here. So he expected to have that speech in just a few minutes' time. The excitement you could feel in that room. There has been some empty seats there for the U.S. delegation. I believe the U.S. ambassador to China, David Perdue, is there as well. Our colleagues there have mentioned that they saw a sign that the ambassador is there traveling with the president as well. So a lot to look forward to, of course, not just with this speech, but also the luncheon that follows here with the South Korean President Lee Jae-myung. Of course, the U.S. and Korea still need to iron out that trade deal on those two nations. And of course, that's going to be the appetizer. The main course is going to be on Thursday when Trump and Xi meet.
That's right. And that could be a game changer for the markets as well. Talk to us about, I guess the tone, the expectations of what could possibly be the deal between the two sides.
It doesn't seem like there's going to be a grand bargain, as some had anticipated maybe a few months ago. But maybe it's just going to be short-term deals that could come through, and maybe some sort of agreement, right? We saw the pictures of him, Air Force One at the Gimhae International Airport, and our colleagues had kind of mentioned and highlighted that, the mood music was a bit different than what we saw in KL. KL, obviously, he was dancing. He seemed to be much more upbeat. This is wrapping up his Asia tour, and perhaps it has been a tiring one for the president as well. So he was a little bit more serious as he landed here in South Korea. But certainly when it comes to what could be ironed out in this deal or agreement with China and Xi is going to be quite interesting. We heard a little bit about it, right? Fentanyl, that seems to be front and center here. That 20% tariff could actually be lowered. We're not sure what levels yet, so waiting for concrete details on that. When it comes to chips, right? Certainly, there was this anticipation that both sides, U.S. and China, are going to have to water down their export curves when it comes to chips, software for the U.S. side of things, rare earths when it comes to China. So what we're hearing so far is, could be the big news, is that, the talk of Nvidia's Blackwell chips, these are the more advanced ones compared to the H20, are going to be something that he's going to be bringing to the table to President Xi. Whether Xi does anything or accepts it certainly is going to be a key question. Of course, when it came to the H20 chips, China has basically encouraged its local companies to not do business with Nvidia when it comes to the H20 chips as well. And Jensen Huang did mention, right, when it comes to the China business, it's already down to zero. So anything that we hear on the Nvidia side with China could be a substantial breakthrough here, according to Jensen Huang as well. So that could be on the agenda. What we haven't heard is going to be about Taiwan. President Trump seemed to downplay a little bit of that, saying, there's not much really to ask when it comes to the Taiwan issue as well. Not sure President Xi is going to bring it up, but we have talked about leading up to this meeting that President Trump wants to talk about and maybe get the U.S. to change their stance when it comes to Taiwan. So that could be something that we're looking at right now. But it seems like on the U.S. side of things, not very high on the priority list has.
Of course, we're coming to you live from that APEC Summit here, there in Gyeongju. Taking a look at where markets are right now, of course, it is a positive market as we speak. Expectations of perhaps better relations between the U.S. and China. Also, that AI rally in anticipation of those discussions between President Xi Jinping as well as Trump himself, not forgetting perhaps expectations from the Fed as well. Take a look where we are in terms of the MSCI Asia Pac Index, currently up by 0.5%, reflecting the positive mood in the market. Let's get a sense of where we are. Mark Cranfield joins us now. Mark, we're just waiting for just more signs for this rally to continue.
Yeah, I think people here are in a pretty good place. They're expecting that this is the year-end rally coming a little bit early, possibly. But then again, earnings have been coming through extremely well, not just from the US side, but across the world. We just today saw Hynix, SK Hynix in Korea producing very good numbers with very high demand for their chips going into 2026. And Advantest in Japan, extraordinary rally going on in the shares there as well. Again, from the AI theme, AI-driven strategies really are bubbling to the surface, and then you've got Nvidia's CEO talking about the fact that he doesn't see a bubble there either. So everything is in place for this to run for a little bit further. And in the background, you're not having any hiccups from the central bank situation. We're fully expecting the Federal Reserve to do its part by lowering interest rates again, probably giving an outlook which would indicate there is more interest rate cuts to come going into 2026. That's not fully priced into the Treasury curve, even though we have the 2-year yield currently around 50 basis points below Fed funds. In the past, we've seen it go as much as 100 basis points below the Fed funds rate. So there could be further to go in that respect. So the background details are very good. Really, the only potential major hiccup is President Xi and President Trump not really having a good conversation later in the week.
Mark, we know that markets in Japan and Korea have had quite a fantastic run. How much more upside do you think?
People are talking about some really big numbers. We saw yesterday some analysts talking about 5,000 for the Kospi index, which is still a long way off yet. We've got people talking about crazy numbers for Japan with the Nikkei breaching 50,000. People are saying that why can't it go to 60,000 as well? So certainly there's a huge amount of optimism out there. And it's not surprising when you see that the S&P 500 is what's it set 4 record closing highs in a row in America, adding on to all the number of record highs it's had this year already. So when you see the US markets, which is the benchmark for everybody, when you see such optimism priced in and those markets continuing to move ahead, it's no wonder that you see something similar going on in Asia, especially where some of the themes are the same. They got the AI chip theme, especially, is very concentrated out here. So what's good for America usually is good for Asia as well.
And also, when you take a look at Korean stocks, despite the rally, they're still looking cheap.
Well, the helps of the currency is pretty much undervalued. You've got a similar situation with Japan and Korea. Both currencies are on the weaker side. That obviously helps from the export sector point of view. Foreign investors look at that and they will say to themselves that as long as we can do some currency hedging, which in Korea is relatively cheap to do because of the shape of the forward curve there, you can put on currency hedges without too much risk to your portfolio. So what it means is you've got the currency factor going in your favor. People can look at the valuations there in places like Korea and Japan, compare it to what they see in other parts of the world. And as you say, they will think to themselves, well, these are not crazy valuations. When you think that Nvidia is on 40 times earnings, something like that, and it's going towards being a $5 trillion company, people will say that if I can get a bit of the currency momentum in there as well, then that gives me an extra reason to be in some of these Asian plays.
Mark, of course, we're showing live pictures from Jeonju in South Korea, where President Trump is expected to speak shortly. I mean, this is one of the most consequential trips he's done. Lots of stake for Asian economies in particular. Key in focus, of course, is U.S.-China talks happening on Thursday. When it comes to the risks to the market, Mark, I mean, how are you assessing? How are the markets assessing that?
It looks as though investors have put a relatively low bar here. They don't have really high expectations out of this meeting. What we've seen documents being signed, whether it's in Malaysia, in Japan. There probably will be something like that in South Korea. It doesn't even look as though traders are fully expect a hard document to be signed. They really just hope to hear that the two presidents are moving forward on fentanyl, whether it's chips related to Nvidia, that at least there's a vague agreement to do more in that place and put things back on the table, reduce tariffs where they can. Anything that's actually written in a document would be a bonus at this stage, and will probably even fire up markets even further. All that they don't want to see is things going backwards. They don't want to see them coming out of the meeting and say, we couldn't agree on this, and we're going to impose those tariffs on the 1st of November that were threatened by President Trump a few weeks ago. That would really be a backward step, and that would probably hurt market sentiment globally, not just in Asia as well. So it's really just a question of achieving what is relatively low-hanging fruit by the look of it. And if investors can get that, then we can just probably move ahead, look forward to the rest of the earnings season in the United States and the ones that come in Hong Kong and Japan soon afterwards. And people will probably think we can have a decent run in to the end of the year because central banks are doing their part. Currencies are relatively stable. And it's really just about companies giving positive outlooks. And there's been plenty of those already, particularly because of the AI demand.
focus, and that really has been what's driving Chinese markets in particular here, as you start to see China double down on, advanced manufacturing, tech innovation, this whole self-sufficiency theme, really in some ways overriding some of the focus on boosting consumption, right? We did get some more lines, though, overnight about, China wanting to significantly boost consumption as in terms of percentage of the share of its economy. Is that something that's actionable when it comes to these Chinese markets?
It's something that they started talking about when they first started boosting stimulus back in September 24. It was one of the key pegs towards that, along with tech and with other industrial factors as well. And if you look at what's happened with consumer staples this year, they've had a pretty rough ride in relation to the rest of the Chinese market. They are up slightly, but nowhere near the kind of levels that we've seen in the main benchmarks in China. So certainly if the Chinese leadership is going to reinforce this idea that more money is going to flow to the consumer sectors, and particularly targeted towards day-to-day spending, that would really be a boost to some of these companies which have been lagging behind. You could get a big rotation play where some of the relatively expensive tech stocks start to see people moving into some of the staples which have lagged behind. But it will need reinforcement. It may even need further easing from the PBOC as well to make sure that people are really behind it. But certainly the fact that they keep on reminding everybody that they are pushing in that direction is all very good signs for people investing in the Chinese market.
Mark, thank you so much for that. And Vaughn, we're already seeing the MC on stage. Trump expected to speak momentarily. Of course, this is happening at Gyeongju. I mean, the reason why it is being held there, Vaughn, is to showcase perhaps Korea's long cultural heritage. But we know it's been quite challenging in terms of accommodation, right? I mean, how has it been on the ground, in the lead up to this meeting? Give us a sense, some color as we await for Trump to come on stage.
Yeah. It's the first question we ask, and we've been talking to when people here, is that how did you get here? It has been a bit of a logistical issue, a nightmare for many. If you're talking about 20,000 visitors that are here and expected to arrive here at the APEC Summit, and I think 700 of them are global leaders as well. So certainly that's going to be a key thing to watch, right? Even for President Trump, he had to land at Gimhae International Airport, then get on a helicopter to get to Gyeongju. I mean, that's a lot easier than most of us. I had a 4.5 car ride from Seoul. So the lodging side of things has been quite limited. There's not that many hotel rooms as well. They've even had to look at even using cruise ships as a way for people to stay there. A similar sort of strategy that was used back in, I think, 2018 during APEC in Papua New Guinea. But people were quite surprised that South Korea, being an advanced economy like itself, had to resort to that sort of approach as well. But yes, it was about cultural heritage, and this was a plan that was in the works in the previous administration, right? So when Lee Jae-myung and his team stepped in, I think it was a bit too last minute to change venues as well. So there is that sort of aspect. It's also cold. That's one thing as well. But yes, there's not that many hotel rooms out there. But certainly we've been able to at least see plenty of people come out here. But yes, they travel far and wide around South Korea. But yes, as you mentioned about President Trump, it has been quite interesting. We're hearing a little bit more about what could be talked about in between with South Korea, as well as with Xi Jinping. So you are seeing maybe signs of some sort of progress that could be achieved here at the end of it. Also, when it came to the menu, right, we're hearing a little bit more about the menu of what's going to be eaten at this luncheon summit between President Lee as well as with President Trump. I believe there is Thousand Island dressing in a nod to, of course, Trump's New York roots. Also, there's Gyeongju rice, I hear, some delicacies as well here. So that is what's going to be on the menu here today, on top of all these sort of geopolitics, diplomacy, and the like.
Without a doubt, Gyeongju now on the global stage. People will know Gyeongju. It will also be known for what's, to be discussed on location there. We talked about how those talks between Trump and President Lee will be crucial as well. He has talked about wanting AI to be the focus for perhaps, Korea to be the platform, to play a global role in the AI supply chain. Talk to us about what's likely to be discussed and what role exactly Korea can play in that.
Right. I mean, of course, when it comes to Korea, it's going to be technology, right? And we've seen similar pacts that have been formed between the U.S. and Japan, as well as with the UK. And so they're hoping to at least have a similar sort of agreement with South Korea when it comes to bolstering cooperation, when it comes to AI, when it comes to quantum computing, 6G and the like. That is something that the South Koreans are hoping to achieve here. But as we've been talking about in that interview with Sherry a few days ago with the president, there are a lot of issues that are still needed to be ironed out. Whether it is the investment pledge, the $350 billion that was agreed to back in July, we're still trying to figure out what exactly has been committed and how they're going to fund it and all that sort of thing. That's one thing. Also, when it comes to tariffs, right? At the moment, when this is contrasting what we're seeing in Japan, right? When President Trump had a very fruitful engagement with the new Prime Minister Takaichi, and one thing was announced was, they had more kind of concrete details of these projects that have been laid out, also capping those auto tariffs at 15% for Japanese car makers. So, South Korea needs to have a deal here, or else their Korean automakers are going to be at a clear disadvantage, because those tariffs will stay at 25% if there is no deal in place. So, there is an anticipation that some more details will be ironed out, and that perhaps more detailed sort of details will come through with this trade deal with Korea. But then again, we talked about where things stand. Obviously, when it came to those U.S. raids in that Hyundai plant, that certainly did sour the relations between Seoul as well as D.C. So they still have a lot of, I guess, trust to rebuild on that front as well. And for the South Korean side, they want to have a deal. But if there's a bit more pushback, they could be seen, and Trump could leave here looking at South Korea as a bit of a reluctant ally.
Right. And China also looking for concessions. We heard from Scott Basson when he was in Malaysia that
and Trump could leave here looking at South Korea as a bit of a reluctant ally.
Right. And China also looking for concessions. We heard from Scott Basson when he was in Malaysia that 100% tariffs are essentially off the table. They've come to what's been described as a successful framework that discussed tricky issues, including fentanyl, including TikTok even. So there's a lot of optimism that a lot of things can come out from the talks between Xi Jinping as well as President Trump tomorrow. That is the sense you're getting on the ground as well, Yvonne.
Anything goes, I think, when it comes to China, right? We could be seeing some progress, right? Whether it's about fentanyl. But as Mark mentioned, right, if we see any signs of Xi or Trump walking away from these talks, markets will get sensitive to those headlines, right? And, we have seen that before. But I think, also when it comes to, Chinese markets and people investing and looking at this trade deal, I think there is a bit of desensitization about, trade headlines. Now, you compare it back to Liberation Day in early April, any headline would move markets in a big way. I think markets now are getting used to this new normal where, it is tension, escalation, de-escalation, or even something, you hear this kind of line, escalate to de-escalate. That sort of is this new regime. So people are maybe not as fussed about, these sort of flare-ups that happen between the U.S. and China now. Yes, there are sort of wobbles here and there, but then again, you're still seeing Chinese markets do quite well this year and outperform. So there is that sense that maybe, investors are not that, they don't care as much because there are so many other themes to invest in and look into in this Chinese market. But yes, firm details, some sort of, something in writing, that would be something that would be substantial as well.
Of course, if you have just joined us, we're coming to you live. Yvonne is coming to us live from Jeonju, where President Trump arrived just under an hour ago. We are expecting him to take to the stage momentarily. We know that the U.S. delegation has made its way to the room, so we are expecting President Trump to speak. He will be addressing all the CEOs present in the room. Like Yvonne mentioned, there's been a lot of buzz in anticipation of what he may have to say. Perhaps the status of bilateral relations between Korea and the U.S., perhaps deals that might be signed, some of the key takeaways from his trip that he has embarked on. Of course, the first stop was Malaysia for the ASEAN Summit. That was followed by a trip to Japan. President Trump is now on stage. Let's take a listen to what he has to say. I think he's just making his way to the stage. Vaughn, in terms of what is expected in the days ahead, you got to imagine, you got to question how success would look like. From what we've seen so far, the tone we've seen from Malaysia, from Japan, it's been pretty positive, and you expect the same because Trump has said that he is confident it will be a successful negotiation with President Xi Jinping.
Yes, and the low-hanging fruit, as we've been talking about, is going to be an extension of that trade truce of 90 days, right? Does this sort of trade war, get to 2026, right? Does it get extended to that? That could be low-hanging fruit. What else could be low-hanging fruit is, of course, as you mentioned, 100% tariffs. Scott Bessent said is off the table, so at least that dials down the temperature. And you have heard from both sides really try to continue these positive vibes before this meeting is underway. We even heard from the People's Daily. This is, of course, the Chinese Communist Party's official mouthpiece, saying, we hope that we can meet halfway. They want to be able to meet in the middle on some of these key issues here. It may not be a grand bargain, but it may be something of short-term fixes there of a long kind of running rivalry between the two nations. So certainly that's going to be the key focus here, whether we do see anything on how many soybeans, for example, that China is going to be purchasing. I'm hearing that Boeing planes could be part of those discussions as well. The fentanyl tariffs, as we mentioned. But then again, we also talked about what else could happen in this trip, right? We're still not sure where these talks are going to be held between Xi and Trump. There's another issue that we're dealing with as a crew here. But also when it came to Kim Jong-un, we heard from the president on Air Force One being asked, would he like to meet with Kim Jong-un at the border? He said, and kind of downplaying that notion, he said he welcomes, meeting with him, but then again, he said that could be something in the future as well. So, but you never know, right? We saw that, I remember, during the G20 when I was in Osaka. That was the key thing. I was ready to wrap up my trip, and then pretty soon after, I was diverted to a trip to Seoul to cover that event. So I think it just depends on the moment. We'll see.
Yeah, and it all depends on, I guess, the chemistry between the leaders. We know that his trip to Japan was touted as really being very successful, and that's pretty much based on the kind of treatment he got from newly minted Prime Minister Takaichi. It was said that she adopted a very conciliatory approach. It involved gifts, it involves flattery, deference as well, and that's bode well. We know that Trump himself took to her really well, saying that, she can have whatever she wants. And that's on the back of that relationship. So I guess the question is really how President Lee and President Trump take to each other in the days ahead.
Yeah, that's quite a contrast, what Takaichi was able to achieve and charm the president during that trip, right? I think it was a golden golf balls that were given as gifts as well. We're hearing the South Koreans are preparing, according to local media, some Sheila-era gold plates, I believe. The dessert at lunch is going to be gold-themed as well, so gold certainly is going to be something of a highlight here. So there is a bit of a contrast, right? And the dynamics are a bit different between Japan as well as South Korea. Japan, as you mentioned, there was a bit of progress here, right? And anything that she wants was the sort of the headline that President Trump said. So there is a bit this alliance that at least is a bit more on stable footing here compared to the South Koreans. So I think there's a lot of work ahead for the President Lee Jae-myung here today. And I'm hearing a bit of pomp and circumstance. The band is playing here right now, so I believe President Trump should be heading to that podium any second now. And of course, everyone is in anticipation. I believe people are getting up in their seats in anticipation of the president. And there he is, waving to the crowd.
Let's take a listen. The man of the hour, President Trump, the President of the United States, now on stage, about to make a speech and address the CEOs in the room. Of course, Korea is the final stop for the president, who's on a three-nation tour to Asia. It started with Malaysia, then to Japan, and now to Korea for the APEC Summit. He is currently at the APEC CEO Summit. As we've been talking about, a crucial meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping happening on Thursday.